House Masters, the hard knock school of everything new construction and remodeling, powered by Home Projects. Now introducing the Home Projects House Masters, Steve and John with Contractor Contracts 101, the ins and outs of construction contracts. Leverage your professionalism.
Welcome to House Masters, presented by Home Projects. I'm Steve, and as always, I'm joined by my colleague John. Before we begin, we ask that you please subscribe to our YouTube channel, hit like, and hit the bell to sign up for push notifications when we publish new videos. This is intended to be an organic discussion, so please leave a comment or leave us a note on one of our socials if you have a question or an idea for a future episode. And of course, please share the video of our podcast in your socials to help get this information out to everyone who needs it. If you're listening to one of our podcasts, please follow the show and give us a 5-star rating. A review would be awesome as well. Our videos and podcasts can be found on our website, on YouTube, and wherever you listen to podcasts. We also ask that you make a donation to our cause. Without your generous support, we'll not be able to continue this educational platform they've been enjoying. So John, we've done several episodes recently about how to be professional as a contractor, dealing with, especially with margin and profit and so forth. And one of the missing components to that discussion is a discussion about contracts. And contracts can also help separate you more or less from your competition when you can kind of present yourself to the owner in a more professional manner. So everything we're going to be talking about here is coming from the general contractor's point of view. And it's not unique to the contract between the general contractor and the owner. Everything we're going to discuss is also relative to subcontracts between you and your subcontractors, your vendors. But everything I'm going to talk about here is kind of overlaps in all the different contract types. So why a contract? Why do you need a contract? As I mentioned before, it sets expectations for professionalism. It kind of draws a line in the sand between you and your competition. More importantly, it helps you define the scope of work, what you're doing, the price you're going to charge them for it, the schedule that you've established for the work, and if there's any changes in any of those three, the contract should provide ways to make those changes, both driven by you and perhaps by your owner, most likely by your owner, your client. It also helps you establish a means for conflict resolution. And I know that sounds really morbid, but you need to be able to look your client in the eye and say, hey, if this goes sideways, if we wake up one day and we don't like each other anymore, and that happens, I've been there, I know John, you've been there, the contract needs to provide for one of three ways to resolve that conflict. And it's usually mediation, arbitration, or litigation. I'm not going to get into the different types or what's different between those, but those are the three main ones that often come up. All contracts define 7 basic ways that seven basic types of income or expenses that you're going to have on behalf of your client. The first one we've talked about in our profit discussion, and that's cost of goods, the COG. Obviously, that has to be established in your contract. The second is labor and management time. I'm not going to go into why labor and management is separate from COG. We discussed that a little bit in our profit discussion, so you can go check out that video. Third is burden, which of course is the cost of your labor. Contingency for everything. Anything in the project that has a contingency. Allowances, overhead and general conditions, which are specifically related to indirect costs, your markup, and or your profit. Those are all the things in a contract that should be specialized and itemized at some level or another. Now I'm going to get into 4 different types of contracts here shortly and show you how each of the 4 different contracts treats each one of those line items a little bit differently. But before we do that, I want to discuss the difference between escalation and contingency. It's way too easy to lump both of those into one bucket. And depending upon the scope of the project, you may want to, but for larger projects, for larger renovations, additions, custom homes, if you're doing commercial work, this is definitely applicable. Escalation is a line item for price changes that you can't plan for. And oftentimes when you're setting up, getting bids from your suppliers, they'll often say, hey, in 6 months from now, these windows are going to go up 3%. You can plan for that. That should show up in your cost of goods. But if the project has other escalations in it, you need to have a line item to plan for that. And that's been very, very evident in COVID times as materials have just gone crazy. And then contingency. It differs from escalation because contingency is designed for unknown conditions, unknown design challenges, unknown site conditions. If you're doing a renovation, contingency is vital because there's more you don't know than what you do know. And then part of contingency in the COVID world now is a phrase called force majeure, which is a fancy word, I think it's French, for act of God. When in my profession, I hadn't dealt with force majeure much. It was something that we all agreed to, but force majeure has really become an element now, and it's specifically related to pandemics, epidemics, acts of God, which could also be natural disasters, fires, earthquakes, floods, all those types of things. Literally things you don't have any control over. It doesn't often impact the cost of the work, but it may often impact schedule and may have an impact on your ability to complete the project on time. And then real quick, the difference between overhead and general conditions. Overhead is the indirect cost of doing business. We talked about this in our profit episode, so I won't go into a whole lot of details here, but that's rent, some types of insurance, non-field staff, your marketing costs, so forth. If you're a larger company, you have executive managers or CEOs who might be on the job site from time to time, who are there looking at safety or doing training or overall quality checks. They would be considered overhead, and they're often represented in your job as a percentage of the job cost.
Any indirect cost that is not assigned to a particular project.
That's correct. Yeah, you are correct. And in addition to overhead, you have general conditions. I don't often hear contractors talk about general conditions unless they're larger commercial contractors, but I have heard of residential contractors and smaller GCs refer to general conditions. And general conditions is actually a COG. It's a cost of good directly to the project, but it's applied to items that aren't necessarily physical in nature. It can also be applied to equipment that's on the job site that you own, but you're renting to yourself for the job, for the purpose of the job. And we can get into that a whole lot later in another episode, how you might rent yourself equipment. But general conditions is often related to, again, things that are specific to the job, but aren't a 2x4 or a sheet of plywood. It could be things like permits, permit costs, permit signs, job site trailer, other site-specific costs like erosion control measures and stormwater management. Again, it's not things that you can hold up to the owner and say, hey, look, we built this today, but it is a cost that goes towards a project. That's called general conditions. And then before we get into specific types of contracts, I want to talk about delivery types and a little bit more specifically how these delivery types work. And so you're probably asking, well, what's a delivery type? Delivery type is the way in which a project is executed. Most people in the smaller residential world with renovations and additions are probably doing a lot of what we call design, bid, build, where the designer, the architect, the interior designer, the residential designer works directly with the owner. And you as the general contractor are not involved in it at all through the design process until you're asked to bid on it. And then you build it. So that's the design, bid, build, delivery process. The second type of delivery process is straight up design build. So the bidding process has been taken completely out of it. That's where the designer, the architect, interior designer, the draftsman works directly for the contractor, not the owner. They work for you. And as a contractor, you're involved heavily in the pre-construction process. During the design process, you're helping establish relationship with the owner, helping with pre-construction questions, creating budgets, making sure the stuff that your designer is designing can be built. I did a lot of design build when I was when I had my construction company, and it was the way I preferred to do it. And then the last delivery method is probably something unique for residential contractors, but for the commercial contractors out there, you'll recognize it. It's a construction manager at risk. Again, the designer works for the owner, just like they do in a design bid build process. But in this case, the contractor has a lot of pre-construction experience with the owner. And we'll get into a little bit more what that means as I talk about specific contract types. So, contracts, one of the main things contracts do is help you define how you make your money, which of course is the reason we're all in business, is to make money. If you're not making money, you're doing something wrong. But the contract is there to help you determine how to make money. So on the design, bid, build, delivery process, the contractor sets the fee, and in many cases, it's never shared. You give them a big number at the bottom, that's your cost. In a design build delivery method, as well as the CM at risk delivery method, the contractor may negotiate that fee since they're taking on less risk as a contractor, and they'll often bid out. What I recommend to clients is they go to different contractors and they negotiate or bid the fee only. So if you're doing a design build project or a CM at risk project and you've got a set of drawings, go out there and find 3 or 4 contractors, really no more than 3, but find 3 contractors whom you think you might want to work with and ask them, how much are you going to charge me in a fee or profit, however you want to look at it, to do this work? And then you select them based on their fee. At this point in time, they have not given you an estimate. There's no budget in place. And that allows you to choose a contractor based on how much they're going to charge you to work with you. Now, in some cases...
Let me ask you a question,
yeah.
Steve. Is that amount based on a percentage or a flat numeric fee?
Well, that's a good question. So the answer is yes, depending on what kind of contract you're doing, and we'll get into that in a bit. There's a design, there's a cost plus, and then there's a cost plus fee. And I'll explain the difference between the two of them. And it's a big difference. It's actually quite significant. Good question, though. And then I have a lot of people ask, where do I get a contract? I don't just pull it out of thin air. One of the best ways is to, if you're in a marketing group or a business networking group, like we talked about in Marketing 101, and you're surrounded by other contractors who have successful contracts in place, or they're using successful contracts, borrow theirs. Ask them, hey, does this work? If the answer is yes, borrow it. I'd always advise you to have an attorney look over it and make sure it does apply to your business specifically, your business model. But there's nothing wrong with borrowing other contracts. Additionally, there's lots of websites out there that offer contracts. LegalZoom is one, but there's a million of them out there that offer standard form contracts you can print off as like a PDF and hand type in or hand write in your terms. But as an architect and a general contractor, I always used the AIA standard form contracts. It's AIA.org, and they are written by attorneys, and they generally benefit the contractor and the architect, which of course is probably a good thing for the contractor and the architect. But in general terms, those AIA contracts are very well written. They've been scrutinized at many levels of the judicial process. They've stood the test of time in appeals courts. They've been challenged in the Supreme Court. All that to mean that they're reliable. And generally speaking, if you're dealing with an educated client, they're going to be familiar with the AIA standard forms. And then, of course, you can also, if those three options aren't viable for you, you can go hire an attorney and have them write one from scratch. But I bet they're probably going to start with an AIA contract as a template before they go into something much further. And so finally, I've got a couple pieces of advice about contracts and about executing a contract before we go into talking about the specific contracts. Number one, hopefully this is obvious as the sun is bright, never do work without a contract. If your client doesn't want you to have a contract in place, then something's wrong. Never trust a handshake. Do not do business on a handshake. I'm sorry to say that. Now, as your relationship develops with the client, you might be able to do change orders and addendums and so forth on a handshake and then followed up by formal communication. But the days of doing business with a handshake are long gone. Always get everything in writing. Email is not reliable, even though it is admissible in court. You should have a formal document in place, even if it's just attached to an email, because emails can actually be edited. Never rely on text messages. Never rely on verbal communications or other standard forms of communication. Everything should be written down. Now, you can certainly do text messages and verbal communications to kind of exchange ideas and get things moving, but never rely on them for legal basis.
And I was reading the other night, Steve, there was a question on one of the Facebook pages in regards to whether texting was admissible in court, and there was actually a court case that texts once were not admissible. If by chance there is proof in the text thread of agreement of a particular term or condition of a contract, then it is admissible in court.
Yeah.
So, it's just something that I wanted to add in there, because a lot of people, some people just hate phones anymore. That's all they want to do is text. And in fact, you're one of them.
I'm one of them, yes. The reason emails and texts are wonky sometimes is one is you have to prove that an agreement was made, but oftentimes it's hard to prove that the person who you are accusing to have sent them actually sent them. I mean, my daughter could come in here and send an email to a client from my email agreeing to something ridiculous, and they're going to use that in the court of law. And there's nothing I can do to prove that I didn't actually write that email. They're very good to establish precedent within a discussion, but the contract itself needs to be have a wet signature on it, or a DocuSign, or some type of legal agreement that's commonly accepted by the courts, and has stood up to the test of time. Just be careful with it. Agree on a contract before you provide the estimate, because oftentimes the contract type, which we're going to talk about here in a little bit, determines what you put in that estimate. Now, I know that sounds backwards. There's probably going to be a lot of people yelling and screaming at me. So, what do you mean sign a contract before you provide an estimate? I didn't say sign the contract. I said you need to agree on a contract type and the general terms in it. And when we get into the 4 different types of contracts, I think that'll make more sense. And never change a contract in the middle of the job. Obviously, addendums happen, change orders happen, things happen on the job site, and the terms of a contract might change. But for general purposes, you don't want to take a fixed sum contract and change it into a cost plus in the middle of the job. It's very, very difficult to do that. And I'll explain a little bit more about that when we get there. So now I'm going to, on the screen, we're going to start talking about the 4 basic types of contracts. And there's really hundreds more out there. I'll be completely honest with you. In my job, one of the largest responsibilities I have is to hire and fire general contractors, interior designers, architects, all the engineering staff. And I see lots and lots of contracts, and they all seem to fall into the major 4 categories that I'm just about ready to talk about. That is the conventional fixed bid project, the cost plus contract, the cost plus fee contract, and a construction manager at risk, which is also kind of a variation on the design build contract. So those are 4 we're going to talk about. The first one, which is up on the screen. Before I go into this, John, do you have anything you want to add or questions you might have about this?
No, you're on a roll, man.
I'm on a roll. Okay. So the conventional fixed bid contract. This is the one that everyone's aware of. This is where you hire an architect or a designer, you do a bunch of drawings, and then you send it out to bid to 2 or 3 contractors. And if you're lucky, they all come back within a certain price range. And the general wisdom is you throw out the low one, you throw out the high one, you take the one in the middle. Nothing wrong with that. I have no preference, actually, moving forward with all 4 of these. I have no one preference over one or the other. I'm just here to explain the difference between them. So again, in a conventional fixed bid, what's included in your project budget is going to be your cost of goods, your labor management, time and burden, escalation, overhead, general conditions, profit, contingency, and allowances. We already talked about what all those mean. If you have any questions about that, hit us up in the comments. I'll be happy to walk you through it. And also, all these graphics I have, I'm happy to share as a PDF as well. At the end of the presentation, they'll all be on one page. Anyway,
I got a question for you, Steve, before we move forward.
Sure.
Number 6 is profit. Is that net profit or gross profit?
So in this particular case, it would be a net profit because it's part of the line item. And because oftentimes there will be profit built into other things like your labor management. You might make money on your escalation and your general conditions. You'll definitely make money on your general conditions. So it's definitely a net profit at this stage in the game.
All right. Well, I saw overhead there being, you had listed that before, and that's what kind of threw me off. I kind of thought it was going to be net, but
it would.
Just wanted to verify that. For that.
Yeah, because every one of these line items could potentially have profit built into it. If you're actually doing it right, you'll make money on each of these line items. Then the second line down is I try to identify how you would present these prices and how do you show the profit. So for a conventional fixed bid, there should be 2 lines on your bid form. One includes all of the items in number 1 through number 7 presented as one number. And then the last item, and only if it's absolutely necessary, you provide allowances for specific material and labor that might be required. Where this comes into play is if, for instance, you're not 100% sure what the cabinetry may look like, but you have a pretty good idea it's probably a $20,000 or $30,000 cabinetry line. Rather than taking a risk and saying, I'm only going to put in $20,000 for the cabinetry, you could provide an allowance for it. And the allowance would be outside of the fixed number that you had provided above. The deliverables in this case, and when I say deliverables, that's generally referring to the types of drawings that your design team presents you, whether they're digital or paper, it doesn't really matter. They're called deliverables because they're delivered to the job. They're often permit drawings or whatever. In this case, in order to have a true fixed bid situation, you need all the data you can possibly get to make sure you've accommodated for everything in the bid. And that's going to require full drawings and full specifications. So the owner, by this time, has provided that all to you, and you have to pour through it and make sure no stone goes unturned. Now, the last line here is risks. Who has it and who doesn't? In this particular case, the owner has almost no risk. They've picked this delivery because it hedges them against surprises and costs, puts all of the risk on the builder, almost all of it. However, you need to pay attention to what we call the exclusions in a contract, the fine print that the contract tells you what I've left out of the bid. And the devil lives there. That's where the problems are. And it can be real simple things like I've excluded, the last 30 feet of the driveway because it's going to be touching a state-maintained road, and I'm just not sure how that's going to work out. Well, that last 30 feet of the driveway could be a big number, and maybe one of your other bidders included that, and that big number makes them $20,000 more than this guy. guess what? You're going to pick this guy because he's $20,000 cheaper. But if you knew that he excluded the last 30 feet of the driveway, you would know that those two bids were probably closer in terms of apples to apples. So you have to look at the exclusions. And as I said before, the contractor has all the risk, including escalation and contingency, which are boogers. And you have to trust your gut on what you put into a project. And this could literally be where you lose a project if you provide too much escalation and contingency. And they're often hired to offset the risk. And the bottom line is banks love fixed bids because it eliminates the risk for them too. And we'll get into a little bit more of that as we move through. You'll start to see as we move through the continuum here, the risk to the banks gets higher and higher as your risk goes down as a general contractor. The second most popular, I think, is, there we go. Let's see. Okay, cost plus margin. So this is what would be conventionally called the cost plus. If you're in the renovation market, home additions, whatever, as I was in doing historic preservation with old buildings, cost plus was the way to go. It shifted almost all the risk off of the contractor and onto the homeowner, and they actually appreciate that. If you can do it right, it actually works out really well. So again, going through the chart, what's included in the budget? Cost of goods, yes. Labor management and time and your burden on such, absolutely. Escalation, big no. Do not need to accommodate for escalation, and I'll explain in a minute. Overhead, yes. General conditions, yes. Net profit, yes. Contingency and allowances, no. And the reason for that is your allowances, your contingency, and your escalation are no longer your problem. They are at the risk of the owner. Now, in exchange for you shifting that risk over to them, you're probably going to make less money on the job, but in terms of net profit. But there's lots of ways to make money in general conditions, overhead, and your project management. So,
and it's just so I understand this correctly. Yep. I mean, I did some cost plus myself, but I wanted to clarify it for the viewers. The reason why escalation, contingency, and allowances are not included in a cost plus is because your cost is based on your receipts. Correct.
Absolutely. Yep. Good description.
I mean, the receipts they say what they say.
They tell the story.
That's going to give you at the end of the job your costs on that job that your margin is going to be determined off of.
Yep.
So escalation, it might have escalated, but whatever the cost was at the time that you bought it is what the cost of the job is.
That's right. And that's a good point. The cost of goods are actually really estimates. They're educated estimates, and you probably went out to your subs and your vendors and you got really good numbers, and you might even sign contracts with them. They may be fixed into a contract with you for that cost, but you, as a general contractor, are not. You are presenting these as estimates. And as I said, typically escalation is not included. It's shifted to the owner. Profit includes overhead and is presented as a percentage of 1 through 2. That's it. So when you present your profit, you're presenting it as a percentage of the cost of goods and your labor. And whatever your market will bear, you should go for. Whether it's 25%, 50%, 100%, go watch our profit episode. John does a really good job of explaining what I just said there. But let me repeat that again. Profit includes overhead, but is presented as a percentage of number 1 and number 2. Deliverables. In this particular case, you're probably going to get by with less and less details in your drawings. You may not have specifications, and that's just because in a design build type project delivery, which is associated often with cost plus margin, you're kind of making stuff up in the field. You may be presented with sketches, napkin sketches as we call it. If there's building permits in place, they are the bare minimum of drawings, And as a general contractor, you're expected to kind of figure this out for you. You have to be well aware of building code. You're not relying on a professional designer often to provide you with the building code requirements. And the risks. So as I said before, the owner assumes risk for all the costs because you may not have a firm budget when you go to the contract. If the project comes in under budget, the owner realizes those savings because, as John said before, it's based on receipts. So if you as a contractor assumed the bag of concrete was going to cost you $8 and you go to the hardware store that day and you get it and it's $7, you're only going to invoice the owner for that $7. Now you're going to mark it up, but the receipt says $7 on it, and that's what they're going to pay for it. So they just saved $1 off of your estimate, which might have said $8. Now, also means you're going to make a little less money on it because your markup is now based on $7 instead of the $8. So that, in some ways, is a risk that is applied to the contractor, and we'll talk about a way to get around that in the next contract form. But one of the downsides to this project delivery type is the fact that the owner has a little bit of leverage on you. I hate to say it, but they do. Because how many times have you heard them say, oh, I'm going to pay for that material because I want to save your markup. Or I'm going to self-perform the painting because I want to save your markup. Over time, that starts to erode your profit. And there's not a whole lot you can do about it. That's one of the downsides to cost plus. Now, there's ways in your contract to penalize them for that. We talked a little bit about that in the profit video, where you can remove warranties, you can remove punch lists. There's lots of things that won't apply to the self-performed work or the work or materials they provided on their own, and therefore that will help reduce your risk, therefore justifying the profit you didn't make when you didn't buy that material. Banks are not crazy about this because of the uneasiness of it. Some banks are okay with it. Draw schedules are tough with a cost plus, and it just gets kind of wonky. So most of the time, homeowners are going to have a cash, going to be paid for cash, or if there's a loan at all, it's collateralized through something other than the house or the work you're doing. So just kind of be aware if you're going after this. So the next contract.
Steve, before we go into that, I want to ask you a question.
Sure.
And I'm speaking in terms of my experience with cost plus. I wanted to see if yours was the same or not. With the fact that the owner is assuming the risk on a cost plus.
Yep.
They're all, and again, this is just based on my experience. I noticed that with that risk also came instability in terms of the time of the project completion. And where I'm going with that is they have not picked out their countertops yet. Mm-hmm. And you're telling them you need to get by the granite store to pick out your countertops. Oh, we know we got to do that. If you have that stuff written in the contract up front, it's already picked.
That's correct.
You don't have to worry about those things. So you're much more susceptible to being delayed on a job and a cost plus than you would be on a fixed contract, correct?
That's correct. And what I often did in my contracts when it came to stuff like that is I actually provide deadlines for when that stuff needed to be selected. And if they missed the deadline, there was a penalty involved. Didn't mean you always had to apply the penalty. It was always at your disposal that if you felt like you were being slowed down, you could provide a penalty for them not making those selections on time. But I also always provide a relatively detailed construction schedule in my contracts. I shied away from start dates and end dates, but once a project got started, I would tell them that, hey, we're going to have a week to do this, and then the critical path item after that's going to be this, and we have 2 weeks for that, and so forth. And I present that as a NAT chart so they could see the logical flow of the work. Also with the caveat that things change, things go bump in the night, and you have to adjust. But if you provide them with a contract that specifies when those things have to be ordered and when you're planning on putting them together, when things go wrong because of what they're doing, then you have a little bit more credibility to stand on. So
one thing I also want to add in terms of contract completion dates and beginning dates. Every state is different in regards to the requirements that are required by the state on a particular contractor's contract. If you are not required by the state that you live in to have a beginning and a completion date, I would hesitate in putting one in.
Don't. Yep.
And the reason being is because the homeowner can make a lot of decisions during the process of a remodel or even a new construction for that matter, that ends up putting off the completion date. But they'll be the first ones to hold you accountable to a completion date if it's on the contract.
Yes.
So if it's going to be used, it should be used more as a guide, not as a constant.
Yep.
But if it's in the contract, you can rest assured that homeowner is going to hold it as a constant.
That's correct.
So
yep. That'll be
there's some protections in there in regards to putting it for you, but really the protections all lie onto the homeowner. So keep that in mind when you're deciding as to whether you are going to put a beginning and a completion date, because there are a lot of states, in fact, unless it's changed over the last year or so in North Carolina, North Carolina's never required a completion date.
No, it has not. That's correct.
So
good point. All right, so from cost margin, cost plus, we're going to move on to cost plus fee. And this is probably the most misunderstood of all four of them. Well, maybe the last one, but this one here eliminates the ability for the homeowner, your client, to remove profit from you by requesting that they purchase materials or self-perform. Because you're no longer earning a profit on the materials, you're literally earning a fee for service. When you go in to buy a new car, the commission that salesperson receives is a flat fee. Usually, it's not a percentage of what they sell the car for. And that's basically what we're talking about here. Your fee is determined up front. You know when you're going to get paid it, how often you're going to get paid, and it's very consistent for you. But it also has the cost plus nature for the homeowner, for the client, where they're assuming the risk. So we'll start from the top here. Again, just like cost plus, escalation, contingency, and allowances are not part of the mix. And just like cost plus, you're going to have a lot of stuff on your project list in your delivery. You're going to have all of the items are going to be identified and thoroughly detailed. But again, they're allowances. These are not hard bids. Now, again, you may have gone out and gotten contract documents from your contracts, from your concrete guy. And he says, yeah, I'm going to do this 300 yards of concrete for X dollars, and here's a contract for it. You might agree to that, but in your contract presentation to your client, it's going to be considered an allowance. Again, typically escalation and general conditions, escalation is not included. All that's shifted to the client, and general conditions are not listed separate, but needed to be included in line item number 1. The profit and overhead is presented as a flat fee, invoiced regularly, and that's really, really important. When I say that invoiced regularly, that means weekly, bi-weekly, monthly at the latest. That way you are getting paid first. Just like when you're saving for retirement, they always tell you to pay yourself first when you're trying to save. Here you're getting paid first. The fee is not directly associated with the value of the cost of goods. In fact, it's usually based on how much management time you're going to have in the project. Now, your if you notice on line number 2 there in the first row, I struck out management time. You're not actually going to present that as a cost to the project, because the management time is actually going to become part of your profit. And I know that sounds weird. When you go to listen to our profit video, we'll tell you not to do that because your labor has a value. But in this particular case, you are literally selling your time. You're a consultant. They are hiring you to manage the project. They are hiring you for your project management time. So if you have a contract that allows you to increase the profit as the scope changes, that's also smart. So again, if you're doing a kitchen renovation and your estimate shows that you're going to have 30 linear feet of cabinetry, and your client goes to a party that weekend, sees their friend's house, and they have 50 linear feet of cabinetry, and they must have that additional 20 feet. And they call you the next day and say, Mr. Contractor, we're going to change the scope of work. We're going to add 20 linear feet to our kitchen. You have to adjust your fee to accommodate that, because now you're going to spend more time managing that product. And where it comes into play the most is when they start adding things that weren't originally in the scope of work, not just simply making things bigger, but adding things like if you're doing a home renovation, you're doing a kitchen. And while you're doing the kitchen renovation, they decide, hey, we're going to also renovate our screen porch. Well, that just added like a month and a half to your schedule. You have to get paid for that. If you don't, you're losing profit. You're now doing project management for free. So your contract has to have terms in there to adjust to changes in scope. The deliverables for a project like this, much like Cost Plus, are very, very simple. Not a lot of detail, mainly because it's usually delivered in a Cost Plus manner. I won't go into that again. The risks. Again, the owner assumes risk for all the costs because you're not providing them a firm budget. The cost of goods are really just allowances. The contractor is greatly reducing their risk, but may have a lower margin because of that. Because because the risk isn't on you, you don't have to make as much. You're assuming less. Also, it allows you to get paid more regularly. If you're doing a true cost plus job, you are at the mercy of the bank, who's probably doing inspections, or at the mercy of the draw schedule that you set up, probably based on percentage of work complete or major permits, or major inspections. You get your foundation inspection, you get paid. You get your framing inspection, you get paid. But it could be months between those major major points in the process. But if you're getting paid a fee that you invoice every 2 weeks, you're going to get paid regardless of what the process in the field is. And again, banks are not crazy about this. It's even more volatile than Cost Plus. But one of the things that owners really, really like about this, I found, because I actually did a lot of this Cost Plus fee stuff, they like it because they have perceived control. They think that, hey, I went to Home Depot this past weekend and found a refrigerator there that I absolutely adore, and I went ahead and bought it, and we're going to put it on the job. As a contractor, you don't care. In fact, you just made money because the fee they're going to pay you for managing that refrigerator is still being paid to you. But they did all the work. They went and bought the refrigerator. They had it delivered. All you have to do is put it in. Now, again, in your contract, you should have some stipulations for owner-provided materials, self-performing. None of that changes. That should always be in your contract. But if they want to take control and do things on their own, the one thing in the contract they cannot take away from you is your fee, and it should be stipulated that way.
So your fee is always going to be a minimum in that scenario. There's no maximum necessarily, but there is a minimum.
Absolutely a minimum, yeah. You are not going to do the project for less than what you put in that contract. If the scope changes, you get paid more, but if the scope goes down, you do not. For instance, when they bought that refrigerator, that technically lowered your scope, but you are still getting paid because it was not your responsibility to have them go out and buy the refrigerator on their own. They chose to do that. Does that make sense? All right, last but not least, the guaranteed maximum price, the GMP. Now, I do a lot of commercial project management, and this is probably by far my favorite contract form when it comes to commercial projects. And I've been working with a lot of residential contracts as well, a lot of residential contractors who I'm trying to get to do this. Now, in many ways, this is very similar to the last one we just talked about, the cost plus fee. But in this particular case, you are actually providing the client with a hard bid, a number that you will go to the bank with literally. So in that first column there, all 8 things are going to be listed, and in great detail. You don't want to leave anything out. Now, if it's a small project, you still want to identify as much detail as you can. But this is really a good opportunity to show your client, hey, I'm in the details. I know what this thing's going to cost, and here are the numbers. The detailed list of items should be firm. By the time you give them to the client, they are firm. They're not allowances. Unless, of course, there's some specific instances that require some allowances. Again, if you've got a big ticket item and you're not exactly sure what it's going to cost, allowance is just fine. Your cost of goods, your COGs, is what guarantees this maximum price. So you're going to go to the client and you're going to say, I'm going to do this project for $5. And in that $5 is all 8 of those things. If I'm able to do the project for $4 and I saved you $1, I'm going to give that $1 back to you. How about that, Mr. Homeowner? I'm going to give it back to you. In some cases, as a homeowner's rep, which I do a lot of, or an owner's rep, I will offer to split those savings, what they call a shared savings. We'll split it 50-50. So if I'm out in the market and I'm able to buy that bag of concrete for $1 cheaper, I'm going to split the savings with you. You're going to get 50 cents, I'm going to get 50 cents. You know what that does? It incentivizes the contractor to be very judicious with your money. Because this is all your money. All 4 forms of these contracts, it's always the owner's money. And if you can find a way to save them $1, or in bigger projects, tens, thousands of dollars, then you should probably get a little bit of that incentive to save it for them. So cost plus, or guaranteed maximum price with shared savings. There's a whole bunch of detail there that I'm not going to go into. We've kind of hashed that all out in previous versions. But the risks. So owners like this because it gives them the hard bid, the hard number they like. The banks love it too, because there's a number. There's a number you can go to financing with. But it also allows them to share in the savings if there is some. As opposed to a hard bid, the first contract we talked about, where if the contractor saves some money along the way, that goes straight in his pocket, adds to the profit, become like a net profit. But in this particular instance, there's a good chance that you're going to give it all back to the owner. At a minimum, you're going to save it. But just like the hard bid, the devil's in the details with those darn exclusions. You got to be real careful what the contractor is excluding here. So under normal circumstances, the general contractor in this particular contract delivery has very little financial risk. Again, it's always the contractor's money. That has changed a little bit recently with COVID, because force majeure comes into play, and contractors are starting to have to be more creative with escalation and contingency to make sure that GMP stays in place. Now, the one thing that will change the GMP is homeowner-driven changes or client-driven changes. So if the client comes to you again and says, I want to add 20 linear feet to the kitchen, that adds to the GMP. So your guaranteed maximum price just went up, but it will not come down. Again, the price stays the same, but I guess it will come down if you have shared savings or so forth, but you're guaranteeing that price. And again, banks love these because it does give you some confidence in the bottom line. And the nature of the contract is that the client is likely going to realize savings. I work with lots of general contractors, and we use this contract a lot, and they are significantly motivated to write you a check at the end of the job and say, hey, Mr. Homeowner, Mr. Client, we saved you 10% on the project. We're going to keep 5% of it. We're going to write you a check back for 5%. So a lot of people say, well, how's this different than cost plus? Well, in cost plus, you're applying a plus to the cost of goods as a separate line item. In this particular model, the profit is set aside as a line item itself. Now, it might be based on the cost of goods and everything else in that list. You might go back to your office and say, okay, the project's going to cost me $5. I'm going to put 25% markup on it. That's my profit. But you're not going to tell them that that's where that profit line came from. You're literally it's almost like a fee in some sense, but the profit is based on the guaranteed maximum price. And if the owner increases the scope of work and the GMP goes up, your profit goes up. But if the GMP goes down, your profit does not. You do not give money away if for some reason they change their mind on the GMP for the project.
I got a question for you.
Yeah.
On the GMP, sight unseen issues.
Yeah.
Say that you are about to build a 1,200 square foot room addition.
Yep.
To the back of the house.
Yep.
And you're in a mountainous region.
Yep.
And it turns out that you start digging footers and you find out that there's a huge boulder sitting right in the middle of the backyard.
Happens all the time.
Yeah. Obviously, that's not a $2.40 cost. That's in addition to this particular contract.
Yep.
You could have a situation in which, in doing the addition, you open up the back wall and there's termite damage that's eaten up all the framing that did not show through the drywall. In those two particular scenarios right there on a guaranteed max.
Yep.
How do those come into play?
That's where the devil's in the details. That's that magic exclusion line that the contractor puts in there. And you literally exclude unseen or unknown conditions. Anything that's hidden by land or hidden by finishes or materials, you exclude those unknowns. And so this is one of the few places where the owner is taking a lot of risk because they will have to come out of pocket. Sometimes they'll have their own contingency fund separate somewhere else. It's what we call bucket of money somewhere else that they'll use to pay for stuff like that. Sometimes it could come out of contingency if the scope of the work allows for it. If you haven't excluded it from your contract or in your exclusions, you say unknown conditions would come out of contingency. That's another way you can do it. But almost 100% of the time, a general contractor is going to have unknown conditions as an exclusion in your contract, and that's where the homeowner or the client becomes responsible for them. Does that make sense? So on the screen here is a big chart that summarizes everything we just talked about. Again, if you'd like a copy of this as a PDF, more than happy to email it to you. I could talk for 3 or 4 hours on each one of these contract types. John knows that, and he told me I couldn't do that tonight. So he's given you a favor. But John, unless you have any other comments or questions or anything you'd like to say, we'll wrap this up and move on to the next one.
No, I think we're good. I think you were pretty thorough on it. And in fact, I learned a lot, actually. My experience, again, on the specialty side was usually more cut and dry. But I used the cost plus quite a bit going into the remodeling type stuff. Seemed like that was the easiest one to use. Let me ask you this before we do shut down. As a residential home remodeler, when you were doing design build, what did you use most common?
So it had a lot to do with the scope of the project, but most of the time I did a cost plus project with lots and lots of details in the contract, penalties for the client, going rogue on you with self-performing work or purchasing your own materials. I had all that buttoned up pretty well. But towards the end of my career, I tended more towards the cost plus fee. And mainly because I was doing design build, I was designing the projects and building them. So I already had a construction, I already had a design fee in place with them. And it was very convenient to just take that fee that they were already paying me for the design and just continue it right through the construction project. And I often used design as a loss leader for the construction. I always made money on it, but it was something I did almost as a way to kind of screen clients or scrutinize clients. In my opinion, if they couldn't pay the design fee, they probably weren't going to be good for the construction either. But I trained them that, hey, I was going to be paying Steven Johnson X dollars every month for his design fee, and I just continue there right through the construction process. And it usually, most cases, it just took all of the awkwardness of discussing the fee or the plus margin out of it. That's how I resolved that.
Yeah, I guess the only other thing that I would add that I thought about again when you were just talking, but I thought about it in the first couple minutes, was one of the biggest lessons that I've learned through the years in writing contracts with homeowners is a lot of times, obviously the scope of work is extremely important. You have to be very clear and detailed with exactly what you are doing. But and a lot of contractors do not realize this until they're actually burned, which I have been. It is almost as equally important to put in some regards what you're not going to be doing.
Yep. Exclusions.
For instance, let's go back to a basic specialty contract, contractors or a specialty trade contract, where you're putting siding and windows in a home. But you're excluding the 2 windows in the garage. You don't just write up on that contract that you're replacing all the windows.
No.
With X brand double hung, with grills and low-E argon gas. That's not going to cut it. You're replacing 28 windows across the house minus the 2 in the garage.
Right.
And if there's any painting involved in regards to that contract, you're painting the exterior, but we're not painting the interior. If you say paint the windows, that homeowner is going to assume that you're painting the interior and the exterior. I promise you.
Yep.
And again, that's exactly what I was burned on up in Virginia with a customer. And the problem is, in that situation, you're coming down to the end of the job looking to get paid. You got your hand out for a check.
Yep.
And the next thing you know, oh, well, you didn't paint the interior trim on my windows. Well, my contract didn't say I needed to. Well, it didn't say you weren't going to.
It didn't say you weren't. Yeah, prove a negative, right?
It says you were going to paint. So,
Yep.
Granted, in the design build process, you tend to be extremely detailed as it is. So it kind of naturally excludes certain things. But those particular instances where you have a particular item or something like that, like let's say for instance, in a kitchen renovation that you're putting in quartz countertops, but you've got this butler pantry over here that's detached from the kitchen, and that's not being replaced.
Right.
It's a countertop. It's adjacent to the kitchen. It's not technically part of the kitchen. It's a butler pantry. You better be clear that the butler pantry's countertop's not going to be replaced.
Yeah, and that's sometimes where a demolition plan or some type of diagram would come in handy to show what parts of the room you are touching or not. They call that area of disturbance AOD. Yeah, that would help there. And you don't have to have an architect or a designer do that. You could, sketch that out.
Point being, just make sure that when you're writing up these contracts, whichever form they may be, that you're thorough.
Yes.
And that you protect yourself.
Absolutely.
Because I know, Steve, you've been burned just like I have on some of these little, things that happen, during a project. And I mean, ignorance, you don't know what you don't know.
You don't know what you don't know. Nope.
And you come across a situation, it's like, well, damn, I wish I would have thought of that before. But, that's why we're having this podcast here in this episode specifically, is to make sure that you dot all your I's and cross your T's.
Yeah, I have a buddy of mine who's an attorney, and I was telling him about since we're talking about contractors here, I'll share this little story. And when I was building, I was sued twice. And in both cases, we settled. There really wasn't any fault. It's a long story as to why we were being sued. But people always told me, you aren't trying hard enough until you've been sued. Well, I couldn't disagree more. If you're doing it well, your contract will prevent you from being sued. And a lot of the things I've talked about here, I've learned because of that, going through that process of being sued. I was sued by the same attorney twice with two different clients. And so that was a dark time in my career. But I take those lessons forward in what I do every day now as a project manager and an owner's rep, and make sure that those errors that I made don't get made on a much grander scale. Talk about the School of Hard Knocks. Here it is. This is living proof.
Well, I was only sued once, but it took a piece out of me.
It did. Yeah. Financially, emotionally, fun. Everything. Yeah. It's not a good time.
Every ounce of your life is affected by it.
Yes.
It's not something that you want to rush out and go do real quick anytime soon.
No. So, well, I think we're at the end here. If you've enjoyed what you've heard, or enjoy is probably the wrong word. If you appreciate what you've heard, again, subscribe.
If you've learned
anything, raise your hand if you learned anything tonight. If you learned anything tonight, please subscribe, hit the bell. If you're listening to the podcast, leave us some comments, give us a 5-star rating, subscribe to the podcast, and more importantly, leave some comments and share this with people. It's going to cost you nothing to hit share and tell people, hey, I learned something here. And again, if there's questions here, if I've said something you don't understand or something you disagree with, challenge me on it. Challenge me and John. We're fallible too, but we're just here telling you what we've learned. Again, I've got this spreadsheet here, this chart, this PDF. I'm more than happy to share it with you. So hit us up on socials or on the website. We'll be more than happy to email it to you. But until the next time, we appreciate you guys hanging out with us, and we'll see you on the flip side. Peace.
Don't forget to like our video and subscribe. Leave a comment or question while you're at it. Your support is very important. Visit www.homeprojects.com to donate via PayPal or GoFundMe. Thank you.